Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that seems obvious until you actually try to answer it. What did people in medieval England really eat? We're talking roughly the 15th century. The tail end of a period historians describe as turbulent, and everyone who lived through it would describe in considerably less academic terms. The food record from this era is detailed enough to be fascinating, and alarming enough to fill 2 hours of very slow, very thorough discussion at exactly the hour of night, when your brain is most receptive to being mildly unsettled. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. England in the 15th century is a place of genuine ongoing difficulty. The Black Death has already done its damage. Roughly a third of Europe's population, gone within a generation, which has the simultaneous effect of improving wages for survivors and reducing the number of people available to appreciate this improvement. The 100 Years' War has just wound down, though wound down is a generous phrase for a long and grinding process that mostly involved large numbers of men standing in fields being unpleasant to each other in official capacities. The Wars of the Roses are beginning, which means that England's aristocracy has organised itself into a coherent system for destroying England's aristocracy. The average life expectancy sits somewhere in the late 30s to mid-40s, though this number is skewed dramatically by childhood mortality, meaning that if you survive to adulthood, you might actually reach your 60s. This was considered a good outcome. The people living in it mostly agreed that it was better than the alternative, which was to not reach your 60s. Into this environment, people ate. They ate 2 to 3 times a day when things were going well, fewer times when things were not. The medieval food record is, in certain respects, surprisingly detailed. We have household accounts, recipe collections, sumptuary laws, guild regulations, and enough church documentation about what you were and were not allowed to eat on any given day that historians have been able to reconstruct a reasonably complete picture of how people fed themselves. That picture contains several elements that will not match what you imagine when you imagine medieval food. The roasted meats you picture, the dramatic feasts, the gleaming turkey legs held by grinning kings. We will get to all of that, and we will address each element with the level of care it deserves, which in some cases means dismantling it carefully, and in other cases means confirming that yes, people did in fact put 28 live musicians inside a pie. And yes, this requires extended discussion. And yes, we will have that discussion later tonight, when you are most likely to be too drowsy to fully process its implications. The structure of tonight's exploration is simple. We are going to follow a day of eating in 15th century England. Waking, breaking fast, working through morning, eating the main meal, surviving the afternoon, and ending somewhere near sleep. Along the way, we will stop at 10 points of interest. Some of these points will be informative, some will be alarming. One of them involves an eel. Tonight we follow a full day of eating in this world. It is long, it is detailed. It will not make you hungry. Congratulations, you have woken up in 15th century England. The good news, you have a roof over your head and access to a working kitchen. The bad news, it is not yet dawn. The room is cold in the specific total way of spaces without central heating, which is everywhere, in all directions, with no negotiation available. And your breakfast consists of bread baked 2 days ago and a cup of ale brewed last week. That is breakfast in the 15th century. Let us begin. The room you wake in is darker than you are used to, not because of any mystical property of the 15th century, but because there are no electric lights anywhere on the planet, and the shutters are still closed against the cold. The rushes on the floor, dried grass mixed with herbs, spread over stone or packed earth, have a particular smell that is not unpleasant, exactly, but that takes some adjustment. It is the smell of something that has been walked on repeatedly and is due for replacement, but will not be replaced today, because replacing rushes is a chore, and it is before dawn. Somewhere in the room, other people are sleeping. The shared nature of sleeping space in this era is not a sign of poverty. It is simply how spaces were organised when warmth was expensive and rooms were not infinitely available. You are warm, or close to warm. The fire in the hearth has burned down to ash and coals. Your breath forms small clouds in front of you and disperses upward. You sit up slowly. The pallet under you is stuffed with straw, which compresses over time into something closer to a stiff mat. So the effect is less cushioned than it might theoretically be, but more cushioned than the stone floor would be, which is the relevant comparison. You pull a wool garment over yourself. The wool is not soft in the modern decorative sense. It is thick and lanolin, heavy and has a smell of its own that is separate from the rushes and the ash. And the people, though all of these smells exist simultaneously, and together form the baseline olfactory experience of this room on this morning. The floor, when your feet reach it, is cold. Not dramatically cold, just the cold of stone in January that has not been near a fire, the kind that announces itself through the soles of your feet, as fact rather than complaint. Before we go further, it helps to understand what your body is working with. The medieval diet, and by medieval we mean specifically 15th century England, which has its own particular configurations, was built primarily around 3 pillars. Bread, which is the foundation of every meal at every social level, eaten morning, midday and evening, forming the background note against which all other food was arranged. Ale, which provides somewhere between a quarter and a third of daily caloric intake for most people, and which we will spend considerable time on this evening. And then an assortment of other things: fish, vegetables, legumes, occasional meat, preserved and salted and pickled, according to season and religious obligation, that vary enormously depending on your position in society, the time of year, and what the church has decided about this particular Tuesday. The flavouring system is almost entirely built on salt and fat, with a secondary layer of sour flavours from vinegar and verjuice that provides the primary brightness in a sauce tradition that is less concerned with complexity than with presence. The sweet, the spiced, the elaborate, these exist, but they are not the centre. The centre is bread and ale, every day for everyone, with minimal exceptions. Someone has rebuilt the fire. The smoke comes before the warmth, which is a persistent feature of this situation. The chimney draws, but smoke travels at the pace it likes, which is slower than you would prefer. The room fills with a low haze that nobody remarks upon because it is not remarkable, because it has been happening every morning for every generation anyone can remember, and will continue to happen for several more. Eventually warmth begins to follow the smoke's path. The trestle table has been set up, or was never fully put away. On it, a loaf of bread, still intact, and a jug. The jug contains ale. This is breakfast. The bread is 2 days old because bread baked 2 days ago is still bread, and bread baked yesterday would be nearly finished by now. And bread baked this morning does not exist yet because baking is a project that begins before this, and will be ready when it is ready. You sit down at the table. Tonight we'll move through 5 specific facts about medieval food. 5 anchors that historians consider verified, and that the historical record supports with reasonable confidence. First, that the church mandated approximately 150 to 180 days per year of fasting from meat, which is to say, roughly half the year. All meat was prohibited for everyone regardless of wealth, preference, or how much you personally liked meat. Second, that ale was not an indulgence, but a nutritional staple, consumed in large quantities by adults and children alike, making up as much as 30% of daily caloric intake for many households, a figure that becomes less alarming when you understand the alternative. Third, that trenchers, the thick bread slabs used as plates, were not wasted after the meal, but collected and distributed to the poor, functioning as a built-in charitable system that required the wealthy to perform charity without being asked to think about it very hard. Fourth, that, at the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, 28 musicians were baked inside a pie as entertainment for a feast, which is a sentence that rewards patience and will receive it in full later tonight. And fifth, that the turkey leg you associate with medieval feasts is not medieval. Turkeys are from the Americas. They did not exist in England in the 15th century. Someone has been conducting an ongoing historical misrepresentation at the Renaissance Fair, and we will address this with appropriate deliberateness. These 5 points are woven through tonight's script. You will encounter them more than once, from different angles. This is intentional. Repetition at this hour of night is not a flaw. The bread on the table is denser than you are imagining. It is not the airy loaf you buy at the grocery store with its soft interior that compresses under a finger and springs back. This bread does not spring back. The crust is structural. Tearing a piece requires a commitment of the jaw and hands simultaneously, a two-handed operation if the loaf is particularly well established, which this one is, being 2 days old and having developed opinions about its own integrity. The interior, once you get there, is close and substantial. It fills the mouth with something that is not exactly flavour, but presence, grain and water, and yeast and thyme, compressed into a form that will sustain you through a morning of physical labour, without making any promises about being pleasant about it. You reach for the ale jug. This is where we begin. The ale in the cup is not what you are thinking. It is not dark and rich and foam, capped, not the amber pint of modern imagination. It is pale, closer to the colour of old straw than anything you would recognise as beer, if you hold it up against what small light is arriving through the gaps in the shutters. It is slightly cloudy. The fermentation process has not been asked to be decorative. It has been asked to be reliable, and it has done that, more or less, within the expectations of the season and the batch. The smell is yeasty and faintly sour, with an undertone of grain that carries a sweetness that is not quite sweet, suggestive of sweetness, the memory of grain before it became this. It is warm because it has been sitting in a pottery jug in a room that is itself only marginally above cold, and warmth is relative this morning. The alcohol content is approximately 1 to 2%, which is to say, almost none. This is the point. This is not a drink designed to intoxicate. It is a drink designed to nourish and hydrate. And the 15th century understood this distinction clearly and consistently. You eat the bread in pieces, tearing and softening and chewing in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The 2-day-old crust does not yield to impatience. It requests deliberateness, a jaw that is willing to commit to the task without resentment. You soften pieces in the ale before chewing them. This is not a sign of defeat. This is technique. The ale does not dissolve the bread. It persuades it toward cooperation, the way cold butter eventually yields when left near warmth without being confronted directly. The result is something between solid and substantial that moves through the process with less effort than the unmodified bread would require. Your body is performing caloric transfer in the early morning without the involvement of anything aesthetically remarkable, and in approximately 40 minutes, when you are standing in the cold outside doing whatever the morning requires, your body will register this as success. Here is the fact that surprises people. Ale was not a luxury, not a social lubricant, not a weekend habit. For most people in 15th century England, ale was a primary food source. Nutritional historians analysing household accounts and dietary records from this period estimate that ale contributed somewhere between 25 and 30% of total daily caloric intake for working adults. The ale was brewed from grain, malted barley primarily, sometimes with additions of oats or wheat, and the process of fermentation, while not producing significant alcohol in the weaker household brews, did produce calories, B vitamins, and enough fermentation activity to make the resulting liquid substantially safer than untreated water from many sources. Drinking water was not universally dangerous. Rural wells in clean areas were often fine, but in towns, near rivers, in densely shared spaces, water genuinely was a risk in ways that ale was not. This understanding extended to children without hesitation or controversy. Children in 15th century England drank ale, not the stronger evening ale, but the lighter brews made specifically for household consumption, small beer, sometimes called table beer, which were brewed weaker and were understood to be appropriate for all ages precisely because the alternative was water from a source whose safety could not be guaranteed. We have taken some time to absorb this fact on behalf of the 15th century, which would find our shock at it genuinely puzzling, the way you might be puzzled if someone expressed alarm that children are allowed to eat bread. The household is properly awake now. The voices in the room have moved from the low, compressed registers of people recently asleep to the slightly more organised sounds of a morning underway. Not loud, but intentional. Someone has opened the door briefly to assess the outside, and a rectangle of grey air has entered and is dissipating. The fire is behaving. The warmth from it has extended to a radius of approximately 4 feet in every direction, which covers the table where you are sitting with something approaching adequacy, and leaves the corners of the room in their own separate situation until midday. The smell of the space is what it is. Ash and bread and wool, and people, layered on rushes that carry several days of accumulated memory. It is not an unpleasant smell in aggregate. It is just honest about what a room is, which most rooms are not given the opportunity to be. Outside, the town sounds are beginning to assert themselves. Hooves somewhere distant, voices conducting the organized business of a settlement performing its morning functions. The light, such as it is, has moved from black to a flat pewter grey that has no particular opinion about the day ahead. The bread you are eating is not a casual product. The assize of bread, a set of regulations first formalized in the 13th century and still in energetic active force throughout the 15th, controlled the weight, price, and composition of bread sold in England with a specificity that would seem remarkable if you forgot that bread was the primary caloric foundation for the majority of the population, and therefore its regulation was essentially the regulation of public survival. The law established several grades. Manche bread, the finest, whitest, most refined, was made from carefully sifted wheat flour with minimal bran content, and it was the bread of the wealthy, the bread that appeared on tables with pretensions to status, soft enough to tear politely. Cheat bread, made from less refined flour with more bran present, was the bread of the middling orders. Maslin bread, a mixture of wheat and rye, and pure dark rye bread were the breads of the poor. The bread you ate announced your position in the social hierarchy with the subtlety of a herald reading your full title aloud in a public square. Additionally, bakers were legally required to mark their loaves, to carve or stamp an identifying symbol into the crust before sale, so that if underweight or substandard bread was found in the market, the responsible baker could be identified, traced, and fined with appropriate efficiency. This is, functionally, a trademark system predating the modern concept of the trademark by several centuries, implemented not for brand recognition but for accountability. The 15th century was not sentimental about fraud involving the basic food supply. You have finished what you are going to finish of breakfast. The jug is lighter. There are crumbs on the board and a faint ring where the base of the jug sat for the duration. A small circular document of this morning. Your stomach is occupied. That is the correct word for it. Not full in the satisfied sense, but occupied in the functional sense, which means it has material to work with and has registered this as adequate for beginning. The difference between occupied and empty is substantial in physical terms, even when it is not substantial in any other terms. The light through the gap in the shutters has moved slightly further toward actual morning. You pull the wool closer. The cloak smells of old wool and the outdoors, wood smoke absorbed from previous days, the particular persistent damp of English winter air, the generic smell of a garment that has lived its life in several kinds of weather and retains evidence of all of them. The ale that supplied your breakfast did not arrive without significant organizational effort behind it. Ale brewing in 15th century England was substantially a female occupation. The alewife, the woman who brewed and sold ale, often from her own home, operating as a small business owner within a regulatory framework that was simultaneously supportive and relentless, was a fixture of English town and village life. Ale tasters were municipal officials whose specific job was to test the local ale for quality and proper measure, to ensure that what was being sold met the standards the relevant regulations required. Being found selling short measure or substandard ale resulted in fines. Persistent offenders faced more dramatic public consequences involving the kind of public visibility that nobody in the 15th century enjoyed. By the late 15th century, a significant change was underway. Hopped beer, imported initially from the Low Countries and resisted at first as a foreign product with an unfamiliar bitter character, was beginning to establish itself as a competitor to the traditional hopless English ale. Hops acted as a preservative, which meant hopped beer kept substantially longer. Ale brewed without hops had a short viable window, days, a week at most, before it began to deteriorate into something less useful. Every batch was brewed to a timetable, distributed quickly, consumed within that window. The ale in your cup this morning is approximately within that window. Approximately is doing considerable work in that sentence, and your body is aware of this at some level below the one you are currently operating on. Mid-morning arrives without ceremony or announcement. Your arms carry the particular heaviness that follows from a morning of physical work begun before the body fully registered. It was awake, not exhaustion, exactly, but evidence. Proof that the morning happened, and that you were present for it. The town outside has reached its full daytime volume. The sounds layered and overlapping in the way of a settlement going about itself. The fire has found a steady, reliable rhythm. The corners of the room remain their own concern. You step outside briefly, This is a different category of cold from the cold inside. Inside cold is managed, negotiated, held at partial bay by walls and fire and the accumulated warmth of bodies sharing a space. Outside cold is direct. It has no interest in management. The frost on the courtyard stones has the hard, definitive quality of a surface that was frozen before dawn and has settled into its position for the morning. The sky is the specific grey of English January that functions as the default setting, neither threatening rain immediately nor offering any indication that it has ruled out rain as an option at any point today. You assess what needs assessing and return inside. The gap in the shutter admits a thin blade of cold air that has been maintaining itself quietly this whole time. The medieval household organised its day around the main meal at midday, not the evening. This arrangement was not a preference, but a practical logic built around available light, physical work schedules, and the caloric requirements of bodies doing physical things in a cold climate. You worked through the morning, you ate your primary meal when the day was at its centre, when you could see to prepare it, and when your body most needed the energy to carry you through the afternoon. And then you worked again in the second half of the day, sustained by whatever the midday meal had provided. The supper in the evening was lighter by design. Leftovers from midday, bread, perhaps a pottage kept warm over the fire. Nothing that required significant new effort to produce. This organisation of eating around the sun's position rather than the clock's hands was standard throughout the medieval period, and would remain largely standard until industrialisation reorganised the human workday around the factory shift, rather than the natural arc of light. Your body is currently performing its own version of this calculation without being asked to. It is mid-morning. The primary meal is roughly 3 hours away. Your body knows this at a level below language. 3 hours of morning remain, and they are filled with whatever the morning is filled with. Work, movement, the organised effort of a day that does not wait for you to be ready for it. Somewhere in the kitchen, or at the hearth, where cooking happens alongside warming. Something is being prepared for midday. The smell of it has not yet arrived, but it will. What arrives on the table at midday depends entirely on what day of the week this is, which depends entirely on what the church has decided about protein. And the church's opinions about protein are extensive and specific, and have been encoded into law and custom for long enough that nobody argues with them as a rule. They simply arrange their meals around them, the way you arrange your route around a permanent obstacle. What those opinions cost you in practical terms. What you are and are not allowed to eat for roughly half of every year. That is next. The kitchen, if you are fortunate enough to have one that is a separate space, rather than simply the hearth end of the room you sleep in, smells of bread, even when no bread is being baked in it. The smell is structural. It lives in the walls, the boards, the stone, absorbed over years of daily baking, until the space itself has become a record of every loaf that was ever made here. On the shelf near the hearth there are loaves at various stages of their useful life. One that is 3 days old, and has achieved the quiet authority of something that knows it is not going anywhere easily. One that is yesterday's, and still technically flexible, if approached correctly. And one from this morning, set to cool, whose smell is the most present thing in the room right now. They are different sizes. They are, if you look closely, different colours. The morning's loaf is slightly darker at the crust. The older one has gone to a particular greyish brown that is the bread equivalent of a determined face. You pick up the 3-day loaf. It is heavier than the fresh one, not because it has gained anything, but because it has lost the air. The gas of fermentation that leavening introduces has finished its work and departed, leaving the structure behind without the lightness. The crust, when you press it, does not yield in any direction. It registers pressure and returns nothing. The interior, if you were to cut it, which you are not doing right now, which nobody is doing without a reason, would be dense and close-grained. The crumb compacted by its own weight over the days since baking. This loaf is not past its purpose. It is at a different stage of its purpose. Bread at this age does not aspire to be eaten as bread alone. It aspires to be the vessel for other things, to be the surface on which a meal is organised, to absorb what is placed upon it, and to be consumed last, or not at all, depending on where you sit at the table and what happens to its contents. The size of bread was not a single law, introduced at a single moment, and left alone. It was a living regulatory framework, adjusted and revised and enforced with varying intensity across 2.5 centuries of English governance, built on a foundational principle that seems simple and is not, that bread, being the primary caloric source for the majority of the population, could not be left to the market to price freely. The price of bread was tied, by legal formula, to the price of grain. When grain prices rose, bread prices rose according to a specific schedule. But bakers were required to absorb some portion of the increase, rather than passing it fully to consumers, because fully passing it would have meant that poor people could not afford to eat. And poor people not being able to afford to eat was understood as a social problem with predictable consequences. This was not altruism, it was practical governance. The same logic applied to the weight of a loaf. A penny had to buy a fixed amount of bread, and if grain was expensive, the loaf got smaller by formula rather than bigger in price, because smaller loaves were distributed more equitably than higher prices. The medieval state understood its bread supply with an intimacy that would seem unusual by later standards, because it had learned through experience what happened when that supply was disrupted. The market in the morning has a quality of organized noise that is different from random noise. It has the rhythm of transactions, of people with things to sell and people with requirements to meet converging on a shared space and making their arrangements. The baker's stall carries loaves in visible ranks. Each loaf has been marked before baking, pressed with a wooden seal, or cut with a knife in a distinctive pattern, so that every loaf in the market can be traced to its source. The marks are not decorative, they are accountabilitive. An ale taster, a municipal official, whose job it was to monitor local ale production for quality and proper measure, has an equivalent in the bread trade, and the bread equivalent walks the market with a set of weights. A loaf that is underweight by the wrong amount, the law had tolerances and exceeding them was the offence, is both evidence and accusation. The mark on the crust tells you whom to hold responsible. The consequences for bakers caught selling underweight bread were calibrated for visibility. The standard punishment, which appears in municipal records with the kind of regularity that suggests it was genuinely applied, rather than merely threatened, was the hurdle punishment. The offending baker was tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame with the underweight loaf hung around his neck, and dragged through the streets of the town behind a horse, or sometimes pulled by a group of bystanders organised for the purpose, so that the full community could observe what had happened and draw whatever conclusions they found appropriate. The loaf around the neck served as the explanation. You did not need to know the baker to understand the situation. Repeat offenders faced the pillory, which was the public humiliation architecture of the medieval town. The wooden frame that held a person immobile at the neck and wrists in the market square, where the public could observe them, and, if they felt strongly enough, participate more directly. Monetary fines were also levied, and fines within the guild system could strip a baker of his operating license entirely. The guild provided some protection against the most punishing enforcement actions, but its members were also responsible to the guild's reputation, which meant that persistent fraud reflected on everyone and was not tolerated by the guild itself as a matter of collective interest. The bread regulations had teeth, and the teeth had been used enough times that everyone in the trade knew they were real. The trestle table in the main room has been set with the things it is set with at midday. A cloth has been laid, not elaborate, not for daily use, but present, because the meal is the primary meal, and it is treated as such even in households that are not trying to impress anyone. On the table, cups, a jug, some implements, and at each place a thick slab of bread cut from a loaf that has been specifically reserved for this purpose. These slabs are approximately 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick, cut wide enough to hold a bowl's worth of food without anything falling over the edge. Not easily, at any rate. They are dark bread, the cheapest grade, because the point of them is not to be eaten first, and is sometimes not to be eaten at all, depending on circumstances. They have been cut from a loaf that is several days old, because several days old bread is structurally ideal for this purpose, in a way that fresh bread is definitively not. You set one of them in front of your place at the table. It sits flat and solid and businesslike. The smell from the direction of the cooking fire has arrived. It has been moving in your direction for the last 20 minutes, advancing in the low, steady way of smells that know they have won. There is nothing preventing them. There is no competing smell strong enough to mask them. They have simply been expanding outward from the source until they occupy the available space. What you are smelling is a pottage, which is the catch, all term for the category of thick, cooked, liquid, containing food that formed the centre of the midday meal for most households in England at this period. and for several centuries before it. The pottage smells of something leguminous. Peas, probably, with an undertone of onion, and the specific flat warmth of something that has been cooking in an iron pot since morning, and has thoroughly committed to becoming what it is. The trencher, which is what those thick bread slabs are called from the old French tranquil, meaning something on which one cuts, was a solution to a practical problem that was so good it persisted for centuries without significant modification. The problem: you need a surface from which to eat hot, wet food. Metal plates exist but are expensive and require maintenance. Pottery bowls are used but are fragile and also expensive relative to grain. Bread, however, is always present, is cheap, can be cut to any size, and has the useful property, in its stale form, of being able to absorb substantial quantities of liquid without immediately dissolving. A fresh bread trencher would be useless. The sauce or pottage placed on it would quickly compromise its structural integrity, and you would have a handful of sauce, soaked bread before the meal was half done. Stale bread, however, has had time to dry and firm. The crust has hardened into something closer to a board. The interior, while dense, resists liquid absorption long enough to function as a surface through an entire meal. By the time the meal is finished, the trencher has absorbed the remnants of everything placed on it: sauce, fat, juices, whatever liquid remained, and has become, in the process, significantly richer in calories and flavour than it was when it was placed on the table. This is not a design flaw. This is the point. The light that comes through the windows at midday in January in England is not dramatically different from the light at mid-morning. It is not noon in July, with its particular insistence. It is the same pewter grey, but marginally more committed to itself, slightly more willing to illuminate, rather than merely suggest. Through the gap in the shutter, you can see the courtyard, the stones still showing the remains of this morning's frost, at the edges where the sun has not reached, which in January is everywhere the sun has not reached, which is most of it. People are moving. The sounds of midday have a different quality from morning sounds. They are less about starting and more about continuing, the sounds of a day that has established its momentum and is in the middle of carrying it forward. The meal is being laid. The trenchers are in place. The cups are filled. Whatever is in the pot is being brought to the table in the vessel that contains it, which will be placed near the centre and from which portions will be served according to a sequence that is not random. Who is served first, from what part of the table, with what quality of bread, with what proportion of meat or fish or vegetables. All of these are not decisions made at the table. They are already decided by the structure of the household and the position of each person within it. The trencher system is part of this structure. Not everyone's trencher goes to the same place when the meal is finished. The destination of the used trencher, soaked with the remnants of the meal, is a question with an answer that has been built into the system so thoroughly that it barely needs to be stated. What happens to the bread that served as your plate, and what that tells you about how this society managed its obligations to the poor, is a thing that deserves its own extended discussion. That discussion is next. The meal has arrived at the table. The pot has been brought from the fire and set at the centre, or near the centre, and someone with the appropriate authority to serve has begun the process of distributing its contents to the people seated along the boards. The pottage is thick. This is not the watery soup of later imagination, but something closer to a very wet porridge, a dense, cooked mass of grain and vegetables and legumes that clings to itself and holds its shape briefly on the trencher before settling. The smell of it has reached every corner of the room now. It is warm in the specific, significant way that hot food in a cold room is warm. Not merely temperature, but relief. The body registering incoming calories as a form of good news. Your trencher is in front of you. It sits flat on the cloth, approximately 10 inches by 8, roughly an inch and a half thick, cut from the stale loaf with a straight edge, and set in place before you arrived at the table. The surface is slightly rough, not smooth, planed but cut, which gives it a texture that holds what is placed on it without sending it immediately toward the edge. When a portion of pottage is ladled onto your trencher, the bread surface absorbs the contact immediately, not visibly, not dramatically, but functionally, pulling the liquid of the sauce into the first millimetre of exposed bread, so that what sits on top remains where it was placed rather than spreading freely. This is not an accident. This is why stale bread was specified. Fresh bread would have drawn the liquid in so aggressively that the structural integrity of the surface would have failed within minutes. Stale bread absorbs at a pace that matches the rate of eating. The trencher system, which functioned as the standard plate arrangement for most of England for several centuries, contained within its design a social mechanism that operated so automatically that it barely required anyone to think about it. Here is how it worked. At the end of a meal in any household above the poverty line, from minor gentry upward, from moderately prosperous craftsmen upward, the used trenchers were collected. They had, by this point, absorbed the remnants of the meal placed on them, the fat from the meat, if there was meat, the liquid from the pottage, the sauce from whatever sauce was served, the incidental juices of whatever else had been present. The trencher was, in other words, significantly more rich than it had been when it was placed on the table. These collected trenchers were placed in an alms basket. The basket went to the gate. At the gate, the poor were waiting. The trenchers were distributed among them. This was the dole, the daily charitable distribution that most households of means were expected to perform, and the trencher system was the mechanism by which it happened without requiring anyone to make a separate decision about it, without requiring anyone to cook extra food or allocate extra resources. The used plates were the charity. The system fed 2 meals at once: the courtyard, or the lane outside, or the space near the kitchen door. Wherever the distribution took place had its own texture at this time of day. People gathered quietly without the kind of organized desperation that the word poverty sometimes conjures, because waiting for the trencher distribution was a known event in the rhythm of the neighborhood, predictable and regular enough to be attended to without urgency. The baskets came out. There was an order to the distribution, not always formalized, but practiced enough to be understood. The trenchers in the basket were not equal to each other. Those from the high end of the table, where the better food had been served, had absorbed better content. Those from the lower end, where simpler food was placed, had absorbed simpler content. Even in the alms basket, the hierarchy of the table was present, distributed according to the same unspoken logic that had governed the meal itself. The hierarchy at the table was not a matter of who liked whom. It was a mapped system, understood by everyone in the room, expressed through food, rather than formal announcement. The high table, literally higher in great halls, raised on a dais, received the finest bread, the finest cuts, the dishes prepared with the most care and the most expensive ingredients. The further down the table you sat, the simpler the bread, the simpler the food, the smaller the portions of anything that was scarce. Salt, in a medieval hall, was placed on the table near the host. The expression above the salt or below the salt was not metaphorical. People above the salt, physically closer to where the salt vessel sat, were of higher status. People below the salt were of lower status. The salt was both seasoning and social map, sitting on the table as a visible marker of where the social order divided. What you received to eat was a function of where you were in relation to that marker. The food system communicated the social system continuously, 3 times a day, without anyone needing to make a speech about it. The pottage on your trencher is hot enough to require patience. You eat it carefully, not slowly for pleasure, but slowly because hot food cannot be rushed without consequences. The bread beneath it has darkened slightly at the contact point, a visible record of the exchange happening between the meal and its vessel. You tear a piece of the trencher's edge, an area not yet covered, still dry, and use it to push the pottage into a smaller territory. This is technique. The trencher's edge functions as a secondary utensil in addition to its primary role as surface. It can be used to gather, to push, to scoop, to transport food from one area to another without the involvement of additional implements. The meal is self-contained in this sense. The plate eats the food, and the food modifies the plate. And at the end, both have changed in ways that were planned. You look down the table. The food is the same, and not the same. The pottage in the pot was prepared once, but how it was served, how much meat or fish had been added for whose portion, what quality of bread was beneath it, whether any additional accompaniment was present at that position. These things differ according to where you are sitting and who determined where you were sitting, which is the host. Who determined it long before the meal began based on criteria that have nothing to do with hunger. Hunger is the same at all positions at the table. The food is not. This disparity is not experienced as injustice by most people at most tables in 15th century England because it is the system, and the system is old enough to be invisible. It is experienced, if at all, as the texture of the world. The bread you have been eating at this meal, not the trencher, but the slices of proper bread that have been set out as accompaniment, is the grade appropriate to your station, which tells you something about your station whether or not you are thinking about it in those terms. The mancha bread at the high end of the table is white and soft and tears readily. It has been made from flour that has been sifted multiple times to remove the bran, a process that takes time and therefore costs money, which is why it is reserved for people who have money. Your bread is not manchet, it is not supposed to be. This is not a complaint. It is just information about where you are in the structure, encoded in what has been set in front of you. The trencher system's charitable function was understood as a built-in obligation rather than an optional act of generosity. The language of medieval charity, in sermons, in household management guides, in the writings of people who thought seriously about how a Christian household should operate, describes the dole not as a gift, but as a duty, something owed to the poor by those who had more. The alms basket was not optional. It was expected. Households that failed to maintain it, that discarded the used trenchers rather than distributing them, that treated the daily dole as something to be suspended when convenient, were understood to be in breach of something. Not a law exactly, but something with as much force as a law, embedded in the social and religious understanding of what it meant to run a household of means in this era. The trencher system made performing this duty automatic. You could not eat without generating the mechanism of the distribution. The used plate was the donation. The system did not allow you to forget. The meal is moving toward its end. The pot is lighter. The trenchers have absorbed what they were placed there to absorb. In a few minutes they will be collected. Someone will carry the basket to wherever the distribution takes place. The people waiting for it are doing so in whatever weather January is currently providing, which in England in January is not decorative. Your trencher, which began the meal as 2 days of old bread and nothing else, has become something more calorically significant, and it will become more significant still to whoever receives it, for whom it may constitute the primary meal of the day rather than a secondary element of someone else's. This is the system working as designed. This is the plate that is also a meal, that is also an obligation, that is also infrastructure. The efficiency of it is almost admirable, and it operated this way, without significant modification, for centuries. The midday meal at its end has a different quality of quiet than the morning does. The sounds of eating have settled into the sounds of finishing. The scraping of implements, the movement of cups, the shift of people around the table toward the kind of stillness that follows sustained activity. The fire is low. The food smell has moved from anticipatory to retrospective. The smell of a meal that has happened rather than one that is about to. Your trencher is at the edge of the table, waiting to be collected. Outside, the afternoon has arrived in the particular undramatic way of January afternoons in England, which is to say that the flat grey has gotten slightly flatter, and the hour is now technically afternoon, which is a distinction of classification rather than of light. What the afternoon requires, and what will require that the body sustain itself through it, is not one more item of food, but one more item of drink. The jug has been refilled. Ale through the afternoon is not a reward for the meal being finished. It is the continuation of the same caloric provision that began at breakfast. Your body is processing the pottage and the bread and the ale it has received today, and it will require more ale before the evening. Not because of thirst in the modern sense, not because the body is depleted, but because ale was the primary fluid of this world, and its provision was continuous rather than occasional. There are days, specific, numbered, religiously mandated days, when what appears at the midday meal is not meat, not pottage with any meat in it, but fish, just fish. And those days are not rare. Those days constitute roughly half the year. What that means for a body, for a household, for a community, trying to sustain itself through an English winter on a protein that requires management, is a story that begins with the church and ends with a dried stockfish that could survive longer than most marriages. That story is next. The jug that has been refilled sits at the table centre, doing what jugs do, which is to be available. The afternoon is underway. The meal has been cleared, or mostly cleared. The trenchers taken, the pot returned to wherever it lives near the fire, the implements collected and stacked. What remains is the jug and the cups and the residual warmth of food recently eaten, which is different from the residual warmth of the fire, but which adds to it, so that the room is, for this brief window of the early afternoon, slightly less cold than it was this morning, and slightly less cold than it will be this evening. The ale in the jug is the same ale it was this morning, same batch, same barrel, same brewer, which means it is approximately 2 days older than it was when it was brewed, and it is still within its window, and the window matters, and we are going to spend some time on what the window means. The cup in your hand is pottery, slightly rough at the rim, the kind of surface that registers on your lip as texture rather than smoothness. The ale is room temperature, which in January means cool rather than cold, and it has the particular quality of mid-batch ale, not the first pour, which tends to be clearer, and not the last, which tends to be murkier, but the middle, reliable, consistent, a liquid that has settled into what it is going to be and is delivering that without variation. The colour, in the flat afternoon light, is pale and slightly golden, like diluted honey, but without the sweetness, the colour of grain carried into liquid form and then fermented into something technically different from either. The taste is yeasty and mildly sour, with a grain sweetness underneath it, and the sourness is not unpleasant. It is the sourness of fermentation, not of spoilage, which is a distinction the 14th and 15th centuries understood very well, because the consequences of confusing them were immediate and instructive. Let us be precise about the numbers. Nutritional historians working with medieval household accounts, the detailed records kept by large households of what was purchased, brewed, and consumed, have estimated that ale provided between 25 and 30% of total daily caloric intake for most working adults in 15th century England. This number, which seems extreme until you think about it, becomes less extreme when you account for what ale actually was in this period. It was not primarily a recreational drink. It was not a drink associated with leisure or celebration or the loosening of social behaviour. It was food. Specifically, it was a liquid food that provided carbohydrates from the grain, B vitamins from the yeast, small amounts of protein, and this is the part that was practically significant, a fermentation environment that made it substantially safer to drink than untreated water from many available sources. You drank ale the way you ate bread, continuously throughout the day, as a matter of caloric maintenance. A labouring adult might consume a gallon or more of ale in a day. A gallon, that is not excess. That is how many calories a body doing sustained physical work in a cold climate requires. And ale was one of the primary mechanisms for delivering them. The afternoon light has shifted slightly, not dramatically, because January in England does not offer dramatic afternoon light, but it has moved from the flat grey of midday to a slightly deeper grey that suggests the sun is tracking west without having fully committed to appearing. The fire has been fed and has responded by producing warmth in its characteristic directional way, toward where it is and not elsewhere. You are within its range, which is 4 feet in every direction, and you are staying there. The jug is within reach. This is a sustainable position. The question of children and ale is one that modern readers encounter with alarm, process through contemporary frameworks, and then either accept or resist, depending on how firmly they have decided that the medieval period must share their values. Let us address it directly. Children in 15th century England drank ale. Not the strong ale of the evening, not the ale with the higher alcohol content brewed for adult consumption after the main meal, but the lighter household ale, called small beer or table beer, specifically brewed at lower strength for general household use. The alcohol content of this brew was low enough that its intoxicating effect on a child was minimal. The fermentation was the point. Fermentation transformed the water used in brewing into something in which bacterial growth was inhibited, making it, in practical terms, safer for children than drinking from a well whose contamination status was variable and unmonitored. Giving a child ale in the 15th century was not negligence or indulgence. It was the provision of a safe fluid in an environment where safe fluids required active production. The medieval household that gave its children small beer was making the same kind of decision that modern households make when they filter their water, choosing the available mechanism for reducing risk. The mechanism happened to involve fermentation. The child survived more often than if they had drunk from the river. The brewer in this world is often a woman, the alewife. We mentioned her this morning briefly. In the context of breakfast, deserves more time than she received. Brewing was, through most of the medieval period, primarily domestic work, organised at the household level and sold locally from the home or from a dedicated brewing house. A woman who brewed ale was typically operating at the scale of a small neighbourhood business, producing enough for the household and a surplus for sale, marking the door of the premises with a bush or pole to indicate that fresh ale was available, pricing it according to the regulations, keeping the volume accurate under the eye of the ale taster who might appear at any time to check. The investment required was not negligible: grain, equipment, fuel, labour, but it was within reach of a household, with modest resources, which made it an accessible small business for women, at a time when accessible small businesses for women were not common. By the late 15th century, the alewives were facing a new competitor that would, over the next century and a half, largely displace them: the commercial brewer, operating at scale, producing hopped beer rather than hopless ale, selling to inns and taverns rather than door-to-door. The shift from ale to beer in England is one of the less celebrated industrial transitions of the early modern period, and it involved the gradual displacement of a predominantly female small-scale industry by a predominantly male large-scale one, and we could spend more time on that, but the afternoon is progressing, and there is more to cover. The smell of the afternoon is different from the smell of the morning. The meal has happened, and the room carries the residue of it: cooked grain, the particular smell of boiled vegetables, the fat undertone of whatever meat was present, if meat was present today, which depended on what day of the week this was, and we will address that specifically shortly. Fire smell is the constant underneath everything else. Wood smoke absorbed into every surface that is porous enough to absorb it, which is most surfaces. The ale smell is there too, familiar enough to be background. You have been smelling ale in this room since you woke up, because there is always a jug, and the jug has a smell. And by now your nose has processed it as part of what rooms smell like, rather than as a distinct thing to notice. The logistics of ale supply were not invisible to the household that depended on it. Ale without hops, the standard English ale of most of the medieval period, had a shelf life of approximately 1 week under favourable conditions, and less under unfavourable ones. Warmth accelerated souring. Poor quality grain in the malt produced off. Flavours that developed quickly. A batch that was fine on Monday might be marginal by Thursday, and something you would rather not describe by Saturday. This meant that brewing was not an occasional event, but a recurring one, scheduled to maintain a continuous supply without gaps. Large households employed dedicated brewers for this purpose. Smaller households brewed on a rotation, typically once a week or once every 10 days, and the timing of brewing was a household management task, as significant as any other. Running out of ale was not a minor inconvenience. Running out of ale was a household emergency, because ale was not a supplement to the diet. It was a structural element of it. The 30% of calories it provided could not simply be replaced by drinking water, because the water might not be safe, and even if it was safe, it provided no calories, and the body required those calories to function through the afternoon. The cup in your hand, at this point in the afternoon, is not your first of the day. It is not tracking toward your last. The day is not organised around whether or not you are drinking ale. The day is organised around work and meals, and the management of temperature and light and obligation. And ale is simply present throughout it, the way background music is present in a space, without anyone deciding to listen to it. You lift the cup. The pottery rim against your lip has the texture of something made by hand, slightly uneven in a way that machine production would not permit, which is because it was made by hand, because everything in this room was made by hand, because the alternative had not been invented yet. The ale is what it is. It does its job. You put the cup down. The afternoon has about 3 hours of usable light remaining, which in January means 3 hours of the specific grey light that England issues in this season as its standard product. After that, the shutters close and the candles or rushlights come out, and the evening begins, and the evening has its own food logic. Lighter, simpler, built around what was left from midday, or what could be made quickly without a large fire. But before evening, there is a specific question that the afternoon raises every time this time of year comes around. A question encoded in church law and enforced by the social pressure of an entire community. What was the animal that was killed to provide the protein on your trencher this noon? And was it the right kind of animal? And is today one of the 150 days per year when no animal of that kind was permitted to you at all? The answer to that last question depends on the calendar, and the calendar this time of year is managed by an institution with opinions about it that are comprehensive and non-negotiable. What those opinions are, and what they required of everybody in England, for roughly half of every year, is where we are going next. The church calendar in 15th century England was not a suggestion. It was a legal and moral framework that structured every year into a pattern of permitted and prohibited foods, and the prohibited category, meaning the days on which you were not allowed to eat the flesh of warm-blooded animals, was larger than most people today would expect it to be. The number that historians have settled on is approximately 150 to 180 days per year of mandated fasting. 150 to 180. If you take the midpoint of that range, 165, you are at roughly 45% of the year. Nearly half of every calendar year for every person in England, regardless of their wealth, their rank, their personal preferences, their distance from a fishmonger, or the temperature outside. For roughly half of every year, the flesh of warm-blooded animals was forbidden at the table. The word fasting, used in this context, requires precision. In modern usage, fasting implies not eating at all, or eating very little. In medieval usage, fasting referred specifically to abstaining from the flesh of warm-blooded creatures. Beef, pork, lamb, venison, chicken, all of it, while fish, dairy, and eggs remained permitted on most fast days. This is still a significant dietary restriction, particularly in a period when meat was one of the primary protein sources for households that could afford it, and particularly in winter when other protein options narrowed. But it was not starvation. It was a substitution, a mandated replacement of one protein category with another. And the English food system had been organised around this substitution for long enough that it had developed its own infrastructure, its own supply chains, its own recipes, and its own extremely creative interpretations of what constituted fish. The specific days were accumulated from several sources simultaneously. Fridays were fast days throughout the year, every week, because Friday was the day of the crucifixion, and abstinence from meat was a form of memorial. Saturdays were added during various periods, vigils. The days before major feast days were fast days. Ember days, 4 sets of 3 days distributed through the year at seasonal intervals, were fast days. And then Lent, 40 days from Ash Wednesday to Easter, during which the fast from meat was continuous. And on specific days within Lent, additional restrictions applied. No dairy, no eggs, so that the fast became truly austere. For the observant Christian household, navigating this calendar was a continuous logistical exercise, planning around the fast days, managing the supply of fish to cover the gaps, ensuring that the household had what it needed on a Wednesday before a feast day, and the following Saturday, and then again through the whole of Lent. The kitchen on a fast day smells different. The absence of meat in what is being cooked is not just a nutritional absence, but an olfactory one. The specific smell of animal fat rendering in a pan, of roasting meat, of stock made from bones, is entirely missing. And what replaces it is the smell of fish being prepared in whatever way the season and the supply and the cook skill permit. If fresh fish is available, it smells of freshness. The clean, slightly marine quality of something recently alive. If what is available is salt fish or dried fish, which on most days in most households that are not near a coast or a major river is what is available, it smells of preservation. Salt fish smells of salt and thyme. And whatever the fish was before it was buried in salt and compressed and left to become shelf-stable. Dried cod, stockfish, smells of extreme dryness and must be soaked for several days before cooking to restore any flexibility to the flesh. And during the soaking it smells of itself reconstituting, which is a smell with a specific character that we will address when we get to the fish chapter. Because the fish chapter is where the eel lives, and the eel deserves its own space. The physical experience of the fast over the course of Lent was measurable. 40 days without meat is 40 days during which the body adapts to a different protein source. Fish provides protein but differently distributed than meat, with different fat profiles, different textures, different cooking requirements. For people who were already eating a diet that was heavily weighted toward bread and grain, the additional removal of meat during Lent meant that the protein component of the diet became entirely dependent on fish, eggs, and dairy until Easter. Eggs and dairy on the more lenient fast days helped considerably. On the stricter days of Lent, eggs and dairy were also prohibited, and the diet narrowed further. For the poor, who might have been eating meat infrequently even outside of Lent, the practical impact of the fast was sometimes less dramatic than for the wealthy, simply because their meat consumption was already low. For the wealthy, whose tables outside of Lent would have featured substantial animal protein at every meal, the transition was more noticeable. They managed it with better fish. The poor managed it with cheaper fish, or with more bread. The fire in the late afternoon has settled into a lower, more efficient state than it maintained during the meal preparation. It is doing what fires do when they are not being asked to do anything specifically, which is to continue existing at a sustainable level while providing warmth at a reduced radius. The room is in its late afternoon configuration, the table cleared, people distributed through the space in whatever their afternoon activities require, the light at the windows having arrived at the particular quality of English January late afternoon that precedes dark by approximately an hour and resembles dark enough that you might mistake it if you had somewhere to be. The ale jug has been refilled again. The fire smells of the kind of wood that burns slowly, which is the ideal wood for a cold afternoon. And the smell of the earlier meal is still present in the room's memory, if not quite in the air. Social enforcement of the fast days was robust and largely unnecessary because the system had been operating long enough to be genuinely internalized. Violation of fast day restrictions was theoretically a sin, and in periods of zealous enforcement, a legal matter, ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over dietary violations, among other things, and parish priests were expected to be attentive to their community's observance. In practice, neighbours were often the most immediate enforcement mechanism, in the same way that any community standard is maintained less by formal authority than by the awareness that your neighbours know what you are doing and have opinions about it. In a town where everyone bought their food at the same market and knew who was buying meat on a Friday, the social pressure of collective observation was substantial. The people who managed to get around the restrictions were generally those with money, connection, and the right dispensations. Papal dispensations, for medical necessity, for example, were available if you had enough money to pursue them. And wealthy households with delicate constitutions or pregnant women found ways to document cases that warranted flexibility. This flexibility was not available to everyone equally, which is a sentence that describes most systems of this period, without much variation. Here is the creative element of the fasting rules that deserves more attention than it typically receives in the historical record: the definition of what constituted fish. The category was interpreted, particularly in England, with a flexibility that would have surprised some of the people who established the original rules. Beavers were, in certain interpretations, acceptable on fast days, because beavers spent a great deal of time in water, and their tails in particular were aquatic enough to qualify. Barnacle geese were held by some authorities to hatch from barnacles on driftwood rather than from eggs, which meant they were not technically birds in the biological sense, and therefore did not fall under the prohibition on warm-blooded meat. Puffins were granted similar treatment. These were not fringe interpretations held by eccentric individuals. They were recorded in texts, discussed by theologians, and apparently accepted at various levels of the church hierarchy in England. The desire to eat something that was not dried fish during the 40 days of Lent was strong enough to generate a small literature of taxonomic creativity. And the creativity was tolerated widely enough that it became custom. The beaver's tail was eaten on fast days in England. This is a documented fact. The church calendar, rigorously enforced in its broad application, contained at its edges a number of extremely practical workarounds for people who had access to beavers. The late afternoon has begun its transition toward evening in the visible way. The grey outside the shutters has moved from flat to slightly darker. The distinction between window and wall has become less clear, and the fire's contribution to the room's light has begun to matter in a way it did not at noon. Someone has brought out a rushlight, a dried rush dipped in tallow fat, a basic light source that produces a small, yellowish flame, and the smell of rendered animal fat and burning grass, which is not decorative, but is functional, providing enough light to see by in the immediate vicinity without pretending to illuminate the whole room. Rushlights were the common light of common households. Candles, made of wax rather than tallow, were expensive enough to be reserved for specific uses. The light you are sitting in right now is the light of a tallow rush, and it is warm and small and undemanding, and it is sufficient for the evening. Tomorrow, there will be decisions to make about what protein is available. If tomorrow is a fast day, and the calculation of whether tomorrow is a fast day requires consulting a calendar that is organized around feast and fast in a rhythm that most people in this period carry in their heads, rather than in a document, then the question of fish supply becomes immediate. Not the fresh fish that a wealthy household near a port might have access to, but the practical fish of the inland household, the preserved, the dried, the salted, the stored, the specific fish that filled the gap between the theology of fasting and the reality of inland England in the 15th century. What those fish were, where they came from, how they were stored, what they tasted like in February when they had been in the salt barrels since October, is a story that belongs to its own chapter. That chapter also contains an eel, which we promised, and we will deliver that promise next. The smell reaches you before anything else does. It is coming from the corner of the room where the soaking vessel has been placed, a wide ceramic bowl filled with water that has already been changed once today, and will need changing again before evening, and in it a piece of stockfish that has been soaking since yesterday morning. The smell of soaking stockfish is not aggressive exactly, but it is present in the room in a way that does not offer you the option of not noticing it. It is the smell of something extremely dry reconstituting itself in water, releasing what it has held compressed inside itself for months of storage. A fish smell. Yes, but filtered through preservation, through salt in some cases, through cold Norwegian wind in others, through time in all cases. It has a marine quality that is not unpleasant, and a second quality that is harder to describe, something between stale and ancient, which is the smell of a food that has been engineered to outlast its own freshness. You lift the edge of the piece in the bowl, it has been in water for almost 30 hours. Before the soaking, it was rigid. Hard enough that you could have used it as a straightage, which is not a metaphor. It was that flat and that stiff. Now it has begun to yield. The edges have softened first, because water penetrates from the outside inward, so the centre is still firmer than the edges. But the whole thing has moved toward flexibility. The colour has lightened slightly from the yellowish, white of the dried state towards something closer to actual fish. The texture, when your finger presses it, returns the kind of resistance that suggests it will eventually cook into something edible. Eventually it needs at least one more day of soaking and several water changes, and then it will need to be boiled, and after that it will need a sauce, because the cooking process will have done the job of making it safe and tender, and will have done nothing at all for its flavour, which it does not have in any particularly interesting quantity. The sauce is the point, and the sauce is a subject for later. Stockfish, dried cod, primarily, though other white fish were dried in the same manner, was one of the foundational trade goods of late medieval northern Europe. The production happened principally in Norway and Iceland, where the combination of cold temperatures, low humidity, and consistent wind created drying conditions that could reduce a large cod to approximately 15% of its original weight in a matter of weeks, without salt, without any other intervention. What resulted was a dense, hard, almost indefinitely shelf, stable product that could be shipped across the North Sea, transported inland by cart, along any reasonably maintained road, and stored in a dry location for a year or more without spoiling. For landlocked England, for the towns and villages, 2 or 3 days travel from the coast. This was not a luxury product. It was the mechanism by which the church's fasting requirements could be met regardless of geography. Without stockfish and the related salted herring trade, the obligation to eat fish for 150 days a year would have been, for much of the English population, a physical impossibility. With it, the obligation was merely inconvenient. The fish pond, if this household has access to one, is a still rectangle of water in the grey morning, its surface flat and cold, and showing nothing of what is beneath it. The cold has not frozen it. It is deep enough and moving enough at the bottom to resist freezing, but the surface has the particular quality of winter water, heavy and dark, and unwilling to reflect much of the sky above it, which is the same flat grey it always is. The smell near the pond is cold water and mud and something organic underneath. The smell of managed water that has been managed for a long time and has developed a character of its own in consequence. There is a net stored at the edge. The fish in the pond are not visible. They are down in the deeper water where the temperature is less terrible, moving slowly, doing what fish do in winter, which is to maintain themselves at a metabolic minimum and wait. The two systems of fish supply operated in parallel and addressed different problems. The preserved fish trade, stockfish, salt herring, pickled sprats, dried and salted varieties of several species, addressed the problem of inland geography, of long distances from fresh water, of months when travel was difficult and fresh supply was uncertain. The fish pond system addressed a different problem: the desire for live, fresh fish in a controlled, on-demand supply that was independent of both weather and trade. Monasteries were the most systematic operators of fish ponds, because monasteries ate fish in large quantities on a predictable schedule and needed reliable supply. A well-appointed monastery might maintain a series of ponds, stews, in the period's terminology, organized in sequence, breeding ponds, growing ponds, holding ponds where fish were kept alive until needed for the table. The fish raised in them were primarily carp, which tolerated confinement well and grew efficiently, pike, which were prized for their flavour, bream, perch, tench, roach. A monastery with good stews was, in practical food terms, considerably better positioned for Lent than one without. The riverbank in the early morning has a sound that is the sound of moving water, which is not a dramatic sound, but a continuous one, the background against which everything else on the bank is placed. The eel traps have been set along the bank at intervals, conical wicker baskets, tapered to a narrow opening at one end, anchored by stakes at angles that position the mouth in the current. The design has not changed significantly in centuries because it does not need to. It addresses the problem it was designed to address, which is that eels move through rivers in a direction and at a predictable time and can be intercepted if you place an opening in their path and attach a narrowing behind it. The wicker is cold and slightly damp under the hand, rough at the cut ends of the reed, smelling of water and mud in the reeds themselves. The river slides past the traps without acknowledging them. The eel was one of the most practically significant freshwater food sources in medieval England, and its significance was built into the economic and administrative structures of the period in ways that are now visible only in historical records. Eel rents, the payment of a specified number of eels per year as part of a tenancy obligation, appear in documents across the medieval period, indicating that eels were valuable enough to function as currency and common enough to be available in the quantities required for rent. The Domesday Book records that Waltham Abbey in Essex received over 100,000 eels annually from its holdings, a figure that makes sense only if eel populations in the rivers and fens of East England were dramatically larger than they are today. Eels were smoked, salted, dried and cooked fresh. They appeared in recipe collections without any particular sense of the remarkable. What was remarkable about eels, to those who thought about these things, was not how they tasted, but where they came from. Nobody in the 15th century could answer this question. Eels in freshwater rivers did not visibly reproduce. No one had seen eel eggs. No one had seen eel larvae. Eels simply appeared, grew, and in autumn disappeared, toward the sea, for reasons that were not understood. Explanations in the natural history literature of the period include spontaneous generation from river mud, generation from horse hairs left in water, and generation from morning dew falling on certain riverbanks. Aristotle had proposed similar ideas. The actual answer, that European eels migrate thousands of miles to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, and their larvae drift back to European rivers on ocean currents, was not available until the 20th century. In the 15th century, the eel was a fish that arrived from nowhere, fed you through Lent, and departed toward an unknown destination in the autumn. The mystery did not make it less edible. The shelf in the pantry holds what winter allows it to hold. The herring barrel in the corner is the largest single item. Barrels of salt herring were purchased in quantity at the autumn herring runs, when the North Sea herring fisheries produced catches large enough to supply an entire winter's fast day requirements, if you had the barrel space and the salt. Salt herring has a smell that fills a pantry and then fills the room adjacent to the pantry and then fills to a reduced but still present degree the room adjacent to that. It is a productive smell in the sense that it indicates the presence of a food supply. It is a smell that a modern nose, encountering it without context, would find overwhelming. A nose that had been living alongside it since October would have filed it somewhere below conscious attention. The smoked red herring, herrings that have been salted and then cold, smoked until they develop a reddish colour and a flavour that is simultaneously salty, smoky and robustly herring, occupy a separate corner. They keep better than plain salt herring. They smell of both things at once. The other species on the shelf are less familiar from a modern perspective. There is a piece of conger eel, salted and dried, the large ocean eel that was fished off the English coast and preserved for inland markets. There is something that might be dried, ray skate, or thornback ray, which appears in medieval market records as a regular commercial item, and was not considered unusual. The category of fish available to a medieval English household was substantially broader than the category of fish available to a modern English supermarket, partly because more species were considered edible, and partly because the need was greater. What you would eat on a fast day depended entirely on what was available, and what was available depended on geography, season, and whatever the preserved fish trade had supplied recently. The piece of fish on the supper table, at this hour of the evening, with a rushlight burning beside it, does not particularly want to be examined. It is not dramatic. It is pale and firm and has been cooked, boiled probably, which is the standard preparation for preserved fish that has been reconstituted, because boiling finishes the rehydration and denatures whatever proteins remain in a way that makes the results safe and chewable. The texture is flackier than it was in the raw state, which is the right direction. The flavour is of salt and fish, and the memory of salt and fish. Not layered or complex, simply present and sustaining. Your trencher is beneath it, the ale is beside it. This is supper on a fast day, and it is what it is. The broader species inventory of the medieval English fish trade included several items that would surprise a modern consumer primarily, because they have drifted out of common use. The dogfish, properly a small shark, classified and marketed simply as fish without ceremony, was a standard commercial species available at coastal markets and inland via the preserve trade. Its flesh is firm, mild, and inoffensive, and it was sold without any of the identity anxiety that now sometimes surrounds it. The lamprey, a jawless parasite of other fish, was considered a delicacy at the high end of the table. It was expensive, it was associated with royal consumption, and it was served to people of status as a mark of the host's resources. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon records that Henry I died in 1135 from a surfeit of lampreys, having been warned by his physician not to eat them, and having eaten them anyway. Whether this is accurate medical history or a moralizing flourish is a question for the scholar. What it tells us is that lampreys were prestigious enough to be associated with royal death, which is a level of cultural significance that most modern fish have not achieved. The stingray, the gudgeon, the sprat, the vendus, species that appear without fanfare in medieval market records and recipe collections, were simply fish, part of the available inventory, eaten on fast days because they were available, and the fast days required something, and this was it. The medieval fish repertoire was wide because the fast day obligation was constant, and the need to fill it was absolute. The supper is nearly finished. The fire has been brought back up for the evening, and its light fills the middle of the room in a warm, unsteady way. Wood. Firelight is never fully still. It moves with the draught and with the nature of burning, and the room moves with it. The rushlight has done its work. The fish has been eaten, and the trencher has absorbed what the trencher absorbed, and the evening is settling into its final phase, which is warmth and gradually less light, and the kind of bodily exhaustion that follows a full day of physical work in a cold climate. The ale jug is lighter than it was. The bones of supper, if there are bones, and fish bones are numerous and small and require attention, have been set aside. What remains of the day is the transition towards sleep, and before that transition, there is one more thing worth knowing about the food that was placed in front of you at every meal today. Not what it was, but how it was made to taste like something. The system of flavour in the 15th century, what salt and fat and vinegar were doing, what spices meant, and why they cost what they cost. Why the dominant flavour of the medieval table was not sweet or savoury, but something older and sharper. That is where we go next. The sauce is being made at the hearth. This is not a large production. A small vessel, a portion of vinegar, some of whatever is available to go into it. But it has a smell that is immediately specific. The hot vinegar smell of something acidic being brought to temperature, which is sharp at the front, and mellows to something warmer and more complex in the few seconds after your nose has adjusted. The mortar and pestle on the table beside the hearth has been in use. The pestle is wet with whatever was ground in it, which appears to be something dried and aromatic, a spice or a mixture, and the smell that is rising from it is adding a top note to the vinegar smell, a brightness that is harder to name, but is definitely there. The person managing this is doing it without consulting anything. This is knowledge carried in the hands. The sauce, when it comes together, is a particular shade of brown, gold. Vinegar gives it the acid colour, and whatever was ground into it has darkened it slightly. It is thin but not watery, with the specific consistency of something that will coat a surface rather than run off it, which is the intended behaviour. The smell of it, close up, is sharp and warm simultaneously. The vinegar's acidity, the salt that has gone into it, the faint sweetness of whatever was added to moderate the harshness. Something herbal underneath. This is not a complex sauce by any modern standard. It is a precise one. Every ingredient in it is doing a specific job, and the job is to make whatever it is poured over taste, like more than it would taste like alone. The word sauce comes from the Latin salsa, meaning a salted thing. This etymology is useful because it tells you what the original understanding of sauce was, not something primarily flavoured with aromatics, or developed through reduction or structured around a stock, but something that begins with salt. Salt was the foundation of medieval flavour in a double sense. It was the primary seasoning and also the primary preservative, which meant it was involved in nearly everything on the table, either as a seasoning or as the mechanism by which the food had survived long enough to reach the table. Salt herring was made with salt. Salt cod was made with salt. The stockfish that had been soaking since yesterday had been treated with salt. The pottage had salt in it. The bread had salt in it. Salt was not optional in the medieval kitchen. It was structural. It was also valuable enough in certain periods and certain places to function as currency. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, thought to be related to the payment of Roman soldiers in salt, or for the purchase of salt, which is a story that may be simplified in its popular form, but reflects a genuine truth about how salt was valued. In 15th century England, salt was obtainable, not exotic, but it was never free, and its management in a household was a matter of genuine economic attention. The fat in the pan has been rendering since before the main cooking started. This is lard. Pork fat. Specifically rendered from the pig that was kept and slaughtered in the autumn, when the pig was at maximum weight after summer grazing. The seasonal logic of meat preservation playing out in the same way it had played out for centuries. Rendered lard is pale and almost odourless when cool. When heated, it develops a smell that is not strong but is deeply present. Animal and warm, and unmistakably the smell of something that has become available for cooking. In the firelight, the fat in the pan has a particular quality of surface, slightly mobile, catching the light at its edges, moving when the pan moves in a way that makes clear. It is liquid despite appearing almost still. The food that goes into fat-based cooking comes out flavoured by the fat, in ways that water-based cooking cannot replicate. Fat carries flavour. Water carries it poorly. This is the physical chemistry of medieval cooking, without the vocabulary of physical chemistry, understood entirely through practice and inherited technique. The dominant flavour of the medieval table was sour. This surprises people who expect medieval food to be primarily sweet, or primarily spiced, or primarily heavy in ways that associate with the image of the Great Hall and the roast boar. The sourness was built into the sauce tradition through two primary ingredients, verjuice and vinegar. Verjuice, from the French verjuice, meaning green juice, was the pressed juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, depending on region and season, a liquid that was powerfully acidic and was used in medieval cooking, the way we use lemon juice, except more broadly. It went into sauces, marinades, potages, anything that needed brightening. Vinegar, wine gone further along the acid spectrum, served a similar function and was sometimes interchangeable. The result was a culinary baseline that was sharper and more acidic than our modern Western palates expect medieval food to be. When historians of medieval food describe the flavour profile as sour, they do not mean unpleasant. They mean that acidity was the primary mechanism for brightness. In a sauce tradition that did not have the citrus fruits that later European cooking would come to rely on, the sourness was functional, intended, and experienced by the people eating it as flavour rather than flaw. In the corner of the shelf, in a small sealed container that is treated with more care than most things on that shelf, is a small quantity of spice. Pepper, perhaps, the most common, the most used, the one most likely to appear in a household that has any pretensions to seasoning its food. When the container is opened, the smell is immediate and concentrated, the sharp, dry, slightly floral heat of black pepper, which is a smell that reads in the brain as warmth before it is processed as a specific aroma. A small amount goes into the sauce vessel. A small amount is what small means in this context, a fraction of what modern recipes use, because pepper arrived in England from India, or the Levant via trade routes of considerable length, and at a cost that reflected the distance travelled. The pinch in the sauce is not casual seasoning. It is a considered addition, a choice about where in the meal the spice goes, and in what quantity. The medieval spice trade and its relationship to status deserves more time than it usually receives, particularly because one of the most persistent myths about medieval food is built on a misunderstanding of why spices were used. The myth is this: that spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, were used to mask the taste of rotting meat, because medieval people could not reliably preserve their meat and were regularly eating things that had gone bad. This myth is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is practical rather than romantic. Spices were expensive. They were expensive because they were imported over enormous distances from South Asia, the Spice Islands, the Middle East, through trade networks controlled by middlemen who charged accordingly at each stage. Pepper cost real money in 15th century England. Saffron cost more. If you had saffron, you were not going to use it to cover up bad meat, because if you had saffron, you also had the household organisation and the food storage capacity to ensure your meat was properly preserved and not bad. And if the meat was bad, you threw it out because eating bad meat would kill you, and the saffron was not going to help with that. Spices were used to flavour good food as an expression of wealth and sophistication. They were status markers. The more spices in your sauce, the more you were communicating about your resources. Serving your guests food that smelled of cloves and ginger was the medieval equivalent of serving them something visibly expensive. The myth of spices masking, rotting, meat says more about what later generations imagined about medieval people than about what medieval people actually did. The fire has found its evening level, higher than it was in the late afternoon, built up for the warmth that the evening requires, burning with a steady generosity that fills the immediate zone around it with real warmth. The sauce vessel is near the fire, keeping warm without cooking further. The bread is within reach. The ale is within reach. The evening meal is coming together in the way that evening meals come together. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the accumulation of small readinesses until the table holds what the table holds, and the people hold, and the people hold, and the meal happens in the way meals happen, when everything is in place. The sauce smells of vinegar and salt and the pinch of pepper, and in the warmth near the fire, it is a genuinely pleasant smell, the kind of warm sour. Salt combination that the body interprets as food in a way that goes below preference, into something closer to need. You finish, not dramatically. The meal is done because the food is done, not because you are full in any modern comfortable sense, but because what was available has been eaten, and the body has noted this, and registered something in the neighbourhood of satisfied. The warmth of the food is now inside rather than outside, a different quality of warmth than the fire provides, more distributed, moving through the system rather than arriving from an external direction. The evening is fully dark, the rush light is low, the fire is the primary light, and it is doing what fire does at this hour, which is to make the room amber and warm in the middle and leave the edges to the shadows. The medieval diet was not diverse in the way we associate with a healthy modern diet. Wide horizontal variety across categories and cultures and cuisines. It was vertically efficient. Bread did a specific job at a high level. It provided calories, carbohydrates, some protein, and enough fibre in sufficient quantity to sustain a body through physical labour. Ale did a specific job. It provided hydration, additional calories, B vitamins, and a bacterial safety profile superior to untreated water. Fish and pottage did a specific job. They provided protein. And, in the case of pottage, vegetables and legumes that contributed whatever variety was present in the system. Salt and fat carried flavour through everything. Vinegar and verjuice cut the fat and provided the brightness. The result was a food system that sustained a working population through cold English winters for centuries, that could be managed at every level of society, from the poorest household to the Great Hall, and that operated within the constraints of what was available, affordable, and permitted on any given day. It was not a system designed for pleasure. It was a system designed for continuation. Most of the population continued. And that was what the system asked of itself. Tomorrow the system continues. And the day after that, and the day after that. Most days in 15th century England were versions of the day we have spent together. Bread and ale and pottage, and fast day fish and the management of warmth and light and the calendar's requirements. But not all days. Some days in a small number of households with the resources to make this possible. The system was pushed to a scale that makes what we have discussed tonight look like the baseline it is. The feast at the top of the social hierarchy in this period was not simply more of the same food in larger quantities. It was a different category of event operating according to its own logic, designed not to feed people but to demonstrate power through food in ways that required planning, infrastructure, and occasionally the assistance of 28 musicians. What a medieval feast actually was, how it was organized, and what it was trying to accomplish. That is next. The Great Hall is a different category of room from the room we have been in all day. Not larger in the way that large rooms are larger, more volume, more distance between walls, but different in the way that spaces designed for an audience are different from spaces designed for living in. The ceiling is higher. The roof timbers are visible above, running in rows toward the far end of the hall, and between them the air has a quality that is higher and colder than the air at the level where people are standing, which is the air that matters, but which never fully convinces the cold that is accumulating up near the rafters. The rushes on the floor have been freshened for today. Herbs have been added, rosemary perhaps, or sweet rushes, and when they are walked on, which is happening now as people take their positions, the smell of the crushed herbs rises briefly before settling back into the general smell of the hall, which is wood smoke, and people in the particular smell of a stone building that has been warmed from the inside for several hundred years. The tables have been set up in their configuration for the feast, not scattered, not informal, arranged to express the room's hierarchy with the same seriousness that the hierarchy is expressed in everything else today. The high table at the far end, set on the dais that raises it slightly above the level of the main floor, with the chair at its centre that is not a bench, because the person who sits in the centre chair at the high table does not sit on a bench. Running down the length of the hall from the high table, the long boards on trestles, covered in cloth, white for the feast, fresh laid, not the cloth of ordinary meals. Candles along the tables, more candles than you have seen in one room, their collective light doing something warmer and more mobile than the fire does, adding movement and colour to the surfaces of the cloth and the metalwork on the table and the faces of the people taking their places. The wine jugs are already set. The cups are already placed. This has been organised, and it shows. The structure of a medieval feast was not what the popular image suggests. It was not simply more food, more of the same things. Larger quantities of roast meat delivered in an ongoing stream while people ate continuously. It was organised into removes, what would later be called courses, but organised differently from the courses of modern formal dining. A remove was a set of dishes, multiple dishes, brought out together and placed on the table simultaneously, from which guests selected, and were served according to their position. When that set was cleared, the next remove arrived. A significant feast might have 3 removes, each containing many separate dishes. The impression was not of one thing at a time, but of abundance. Tables laden with multiple preparations simultaneously. The visual weight of the food communicating the host's resources before anyone had taken a bite. The table was itself part of the statement. Hands are washed before eating. This is not optional ceremony. It is practical and it is public. Ewers of warm water, scented with herbs or flowers, are carried among the tables by servants, accompanied by towels, and the washing of hands before the meal is a sequence that the hall performs in order, beginning at the high table and moving outward. The water smells of lavender or herbs, and the smell of it is a specific marker of this kind of meal. You do not scent the washing water if you are eating in a small household on an ordinary day. But today is not an ordinary day. The water is warm and the towel is clean, and the washing is done in public view, because public view is the point. Everything at a feast is done in public view. Everything at a feast is a performance whose audience is everyone in the room, and everyone in the room understands they are both performer and audience simultaneously. What arrived at the tables of a significant medieval feast was not the roast turkey leg of the Renaissance fair. This requires a moment. Turkeys did not exist in England in the 15th century. They were introduced to Europe from the Americas in the early 16th century, which means that every turkey leg currently being sold at a medieval themed event as an authentic medieval food experience is representing the post-Columbian period at minimum, which is not the medieval period, which is a distinction that matters to anyone who has thought about it for 30 seconds. What was actually served at a significant medieval feast, at the level of a great lord's celebration or a royal occasion, included swans. Swans were royal birds, owned by the crown, and serving a swan at your feast was a statement about your status and your connections. They were prepared for the table, and sometimes redressed in their feathers after roasting. The cooked bird presented wearing its plumage, as if still alive, a piece of theatrical presentation that was designed to impress, and did impress. Peacocks were treated similarly, cooked, redressed in their feathers, sometimes with gilded beaks, presented at the table as spectacle. The porpoise, classified as fish for fasting purposes, and therefore available on fast days, appeared at high table feasts as a prestige item. Lamprey pies, the same lamprey that allegedly caused the death of Henry, appeared as a luxury preparation for important guests. The seating at a feast was organised with even more precision than at ordinary meals, because the stakes were higher. Your position at the table in relation to the high table, your distance from the salt, your proximity to the centre of the room, all of these communicated information about where you stood in relation to the host, to the other guests, to the hierarchy of the occasion. Being placed well at a feast was a social statement. Being placed poorly, or being placed at the lower end of the lower tables, was equally communicative in the opposite direction. The food that arrived at different positions was not the same. The high table received the finest preparations, the swan, the lamprey, the dishes prepared with the most expensive spices, the wine of the best available quality. The further from the high table, the simpler the food, and the lower the wine. You could read the entire social map of the occasion from what arrived at each position, and what did not. The noise of the hall at a feast is substantial. This is not the quiet of a domestic supper. There are many people, the space is large and hard, surfaced and reflects sound in every direction. There are servants moving along the tables, carrying dishes. There are conversations at multiple registers happening simultaneously. And underneath all of it, from somewhere not immediately visible, there is music. The music at a medieval feast was not background music in the modern sense. It was not ambient, not optional, not decoration. It was part of the event. Musicians performed during the meal, between removes, and at specific moments designed for musical presentation. They performed from galleries above the hall in great houses, or from positions at the end of the room, or occasionally from positions closer to the tables than you might expect. The specific relationship between musicians and the physical space of the feast hall was, it turns out, flexible enough to include positions that would not immediately occur to you. We will come to those positions in detail very shortly. The entremets were the element of the feast that has no real equivalent in modern dining, and that requires the most adjustment of expectation to understand. An entremet, literally, between the courses, was an interlude between removes that was primarily spectacle rather than food. It might be a theatrical performance. It might be a display of elaborate decorative objects, sugar sculptures, subtleties made from marzipan or pastry formed into castles or animals or allegorical scenes. It might be a musical presentation. It might be all of these simultaneously. The entremet communicated that the host was not merely feeding guests but entertaining them, that the feast was a cultural event as well as a nutritional one, and that the resources available to the host extended beyond food into display. In the grandest feasts, the line between food and performance became genuinely unclear, and it was this deliberate blurring of the line that produced the event for which all of this has been building. The evening in the hall is at its height. The removes have progressed. The wine has circulated. The candles are lower than they were when the feast began, the wax having been burning for several hours, and their collective light has shifted from the bright initial warmth of new candles to something slightly more amber and slightly more unsteady, which is the light of candles that have been working. The hall is warm, many people, fires at both ends of the space, the collective warmth of sustained eating and drinking in an enclosed stone room, and the warmth has risen to the level where the top buttons of things would be loosened if there were buttons, which there mostly are not, but the general sense of the evening is one of a gathering that has reached the point of comfortable. The next remove is being prepared somewhere you cannot see. Something is being assembled. You have heard it said that tonight there is to be an entremet of a particular kind. The specifics have not been shared. The rumour is that something has been made, something large, and that it contains something alive. You are not sure what to make of this information. You are about to find out. The feast you are about to witness was not the ordinary feast of an ordinary English lord. It was the specific feast of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, at Lille in 1454, an event known to historians as the Feast of the Pheasant. The Feast of the Pheasant was organised as a political event, a vow-taking ceremony in which Philip and his nobles pledged to undertake a crusade. a crusade that was never actually launched, but whose planning provided the occasion for one of the most extensively documented feasts of the late medieval period. The documentation is detailed enough that historians know not just what was served, but what the entremets consisted of, how they were organised, how many people participated in them, and specifically, in one case that requires its own extended treatment, what was inside a very large pie. That information is next. The pie arrives at the hall in the way that significant things arrive at medieval feasts, carried by more people than the object strictly requires, on a platform or board, with a deliberateness of movement that communicates that this is not an ordinary delivery. It is large. This is the first thing you notice. It is large enough that its size registers as a category, rather than a measurement. Not a big pie, not an unusually large pie, but a different kind of object that happens to be pie, shaped, which is its disguise rather than its identity. The pastry is set, firm, baked, the crust a deep golden brown that reflects the candlelight along the top. It has been made from a thick flour and water paste called the coffin, which is not meant to be eaten, but to be a container, a mould, a structural vessel for what it holds inside. The coffin crust of a medieval pie was often discarded after serving, its job being to hold the contents and maintain their shape, rather than to be consumed. This particular coffin is holding its contents with some success. The contents are not moving visibly. This is deliberate. The pie is carried to the centre of the hall and set down. You are watching from your position at the table, which is not the best position. The best positions are at the high table, where Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, is seated. But it is sufficient to see what is happening. The hall has gone quieter, not silent. Silence is difficult in a stone hall with this many people and the fire at both ends. But the quality of the noise has changed from the active noise of a feast in progress to something more attentive, the collective orientation of a room toward a single object. The pie sits on its platform. Someone near the high table says something that is inaudible at your distance. The lid of the pie is removed. The Feast of the Pheasant was held at Lille on the 18th of February 1454, organised by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, as a political and ceremonial event, centred on the taking of vows to undertake a new crusade, a response to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks the previous year. The Feast of the Pheasant is one of the most thoroughly documented large-scale feasts of the late medieval period. The chronicler Olivier de la Marche attended and wrote a detailed account of the proceedings. Other contemporary records supplement his description. From these sources, historians have been able to reconstruct not only the food served, which was extensive and elaborate, but the specific entremets prepared for the occasion, which were themselves elaborate in a way that had required significant advance planning and, in at least one case, significant advance rehearsal. The feast was not primarily a food event. It was a political theatre event at which food was the stage set. The vows taken on this occasion were never fulfilled. The crusade was never launched, but the feast was remembered. The hall on this occasion had been set with specific theatrical elements before the feast began. Among the items documented by de la Marche, a model church with moving figures and a working bell, a living lion brought into the hall on a leash, a model ship with rigging, complete with a crew performing simulated naval activities, an elephant, either real or represented, accounts vary, carrying a figure dressed as a noblewoman, and then the pies, multiple pies of substantial size, were part of the entertainment, and one of them, the one that is the reason we are here tonight, contained 28 musicians. 28. The documentation is consistent on this number. The musicians were sealed into the pie, in the pie inside the pastry coffin, in a space large enough to accommodate them and their instruments. And at the appointed moment, when the lid was removed, they began to play. The records indicate they played. The records do not indicate what the musicians felt about the arrangement, which is perhaps appropriate, since what the musicians felt about the arrangement is not the kind of information that a chronicler writing for a duke would have considered worth documenting. The interior of the coffin pie, at the moment of opening, releases what the interior has been containing, the smell of 28 people, and their instruments in a sealed pastry enclosure, for however long the assembly and transport and waiting have required. The candles in the hall provide the light that now reaches into the interior. The musicians, who have been in darkness and compression, are now in candlelight and visible. They are playing. The music that emerges from the pie is, therefore, the first sound the assembled nobility of Burgundy has heard from this direction. and the direction is the inside of a pie. And the music is real musicians playing real instruments in an enclosed pastry container in the centre of a feast hall on the occasion of a ceremonial vow to go to war with the Ottoman Empire. This is happening. It has been planned. It went as planned. The other food at the Feast of the Pheasant was extensive. Delamarche records multiple courses, elaborate presentations, and specific dishes of the kind that appear in feast records of this period. Elaborate meat preparations, fish preparations, cold aspic work, elaborate pastry constructions, whose purpose was visual as much as culinary. Aspic, the gelatin, base-setting medium made from reduced stock, was used in medieval high-end cooking to create cold, moulded presentations that held their shape at room temperature, which was considered impressive and was, technically speaking, impressive, requiring skill and expensive gelatin sources and time and precise temperature management. The aspic preparations at a feast of this level would have been made days in advance, set in moulds, unmoulded and arranged on presentation dishes, and carried to the table in their final form, cold and shining and impossible to mistake for anything improvised. The specific dishes documented at the Feast of the Pheasant include preparations that appear in other feast records of the period under various names. Mummony, sometimes spelled mammony or mormony, was a dish of stewed meat, typically poultry, in a sweetened, spiced sauce, thickened and coloured with sandalwood or saffron, served in the elaborate style appropriate to a high-status occasion. The name appears to derive from the Arabic mamuniya, which is itself evidence of the trade routes by which both the dish and its ingredients arrived in European court cooking. The sauce tradition at this level of feast was substantially different from the vinegar and salt sauce of the ordinary household. It included more spices, more imported ingredients, more labour-intensive preparation, and more deliberate sweetness. Because sweetness at this level of cooking was expensive and therefore communicative. Sugar, in 15th century England, was a spice. It was sold by apothecaries alongside pepper and ginger, and it was used in small quantities in preparations, where its cost would be visible in the final product. A sauce that was detectably sweet was a sauce that had cost something. The candles in the hall are lower now. The feast has been progressing for some time. These events did not conclude in 2 hours, but could extend through an entire evening, with removes and entremets and music and dancing, and the kind of extended social performance that the great feast was designed to support. The musicians from the pie have presumably been released. The records do not specify exactly when they emerged or how, which suggests that the logistics of extracting 28 musicians from a pastry container in a dignified manner were managed without incident, or were managed with incident but without documentation. They are playing elsewhere in the hall now. The vows have been taken, or will be taken. Philip and his nobles will swear on a live pheasant, decorated for the occasion, that they will join the crusade, and the pheasant will survive the experience in better condition than the Ottoman Turks eventually would. The hall is warm and loud and smells of a feast that has been happening for hours. The turkey leg, which must be addressed before we leave this chapter, is not here. It was not here. It could not have been here. Turkeys, the birds known as Melagris galapavo, are indigenous to the Americas. The Americas were reached by European sailors in 1492, which is 38 years after the Feast of the Pheasant, and after the death of most of the people who attended it. The turkey arrived in Europe sometime in the early 16th century, was domesticated within a generation, and within another generation had become common enough to appear in English market records. By the later 16th century it was present in England. By the 18th century it was standard. By the 20th century it had become the universal symbol of medieval feasting, in a way that nobody in the 15th century could have predicted, because nobody in the 15th century had seen a turkey. The bird being sold to you at the Renaissance fair on a stick, presented as an authentic medieval food experience, is not medieval. The person selling it to you may know this. They may have made a calculation about the relationship between historical accuracy and commerce. You now know what they know, and you can make your own decisions going forward. The feast at Lille comes to its end in the way that extended formal occasions come to their ends, gradually, with ceremony, the elements of the event closing in sequence, until what remains is the hall itself, and the people who are responsible for restoring it to its ordinary state. The tables will be cleared. The boards and trestles will be disassembled and stored. The candle stubs will be collected. The rush floor will need attention tomorrow. Outside, the February night is cold in the specific way of Belgian February, which is to say, cold. The musicians have gone. The lion has gone. The pie has gone, though pieces of it may still be somewhere in the hall. The coffin pastry having served its purpose, and having been dealt with in whatever way leftover coffin pastry is dealt with when 28 musicians are done with it. What remains, besides the considerable logistics of post-feast management, is the question we have been building toward all evening. What did the food we have discussed tonight actually do to the bodies of the people who ate it? What were the physical consequences of this diet? What did bread and ale and fish and fasting and the occasional feast leave behind in the people who lived it? That question is the last thing we have to address tonight, and we will address it now. It is late. Not the lateness of a feast that has not yet ended, but the lateness of the ordinary day, the house kind of late, the fire low, the rushlight nearly spent, the shapes of the room softer in what remains of the light. This is the hour when the body makes its accounting, not consciously, not deliberately. The body keeps its records without being asked, running its inventory of what came in and what was used and what remains. And at this hour of the night, the inventory is almost always incomplete in some direction. The question of whether today was enough is one that the 15th century body asked more often than the modern body does, and more often got an answer that required adjustment. Less than ideal, sufficient to continue, sufficient for tomorrow, which is the bar that the day was required to clear. Your body, which has spent this day in 15th century England, has received the following: ale at breakfast, and bread, stale enough to require softening, more bread through the morning, pottage at midday, ladled onto a trencher, with whatever protein the day's fast status permitted, ale through the afternoon. Repeated, fish at supper preserved, with a sauce of vinegar and salt, and a pinch of pepper, bread again at supper, more ale. The body has processed all of this with the efficiency that bodies develop when they have been processing variations of this combination for their entire lives, and their parents' lives, and their grandparents' lives, before that. The body is tired. The body is not dramatically malnourished. The body will wake tomorrow and do most of this again. The physical evidence of the medieval diet, what we can reconstruct from the bones and teeth of people who lived in this period, examined by historians and physical anthropologists working from burial sites, is more nuanced than either the idealized version or the horror story version would suggest. Medieval people were, on average, somewhat shorter than modern Western populations, a difference accounted for primarily by childhood nutrition rather than genetics. The early years, when growth is most determinative, were the years when food supply was most variable, and variable food supply in childhood produces adults who are somewhat shorter than their genetic potential. But the medieval skeleton is generally robust. The bones of people who did physical labor their entire lives reflect that labor denser, more developed, evidence of sustained muscular stress, in ways that are visible to physical examination centuries later. The teeth, which might be expected to be terrible, are in many cases better than the teeth of 19th century populations who had access to refined sugar in quantities that medieval people never did. The medieval sweet tooth was indulged rarely, with expensive sweeteners, in small amounts. The tooth decay that epidemic sugar access produces was therefore less prevalent. The medieval mouth had its own problems, where from coarse bread, grit in the grain, other abrasive exposures. But it did not have the particular devastation of the sugar century. You are sitting near the fire in the last of its warmth. The room is quiet. The other people in it have settled into the arrangements of sleep. That shared sleeping space requires negotiated positions, shared warmth, the breathing of a room that has given up on wakefulness. The darkness is thorough, not the darkness of a room with the light off, which is never fully dark because light comes from under doors and through gaps and from screens. This is a room where the only light is the last of the fire, a glow rather than a flame, and it is at the edge of your vision rather than the centre of it. The cold has advanced from the corners, which have been cold all day, toward the space near the fire, which is cooler than it was an hour ago. The rushes smell of the day, the herbs that were in them, the footsteps that crushed them, the cooking and the eating and the people. It is the smell of a room that has been lived in today. 5 things before you sleep, 5 things that the day contained, that are now part of what you know about this world, and that will be part of what you carry out of it. First, the fasting days, 150 to 180 of them per year, the church's calendar making half the year meatless, the English food system organised for centuries around the rotation of permitted and prohibited proteins. the body adapting as bodies adapt. Not enthusiastically, but successfully, Lent after Lent, Friday after Friday. The fish supply managing what it managed. What the fasting days did to the population is visible in how the fish trade was organised, in the infrastructure of stews and salt barrels and the stockfish trade, in the creative theology of the beaver's tail and the barnacle goose. The body adapted, the infrastructure adapted. The church continued to have opinions, and the opinions continued to be followed. Second, the ale. 30% of daily caloric intake, the children drinking their small beer, the alewives managing the batches, the ale, tasters walking the markets, the window of a week before souring, the body receiving its B vitamins and its fermentation, safe hydration through a system that was not incidental but engineered. The ale was not a failure of foresight. It was a solution to a real problem, maintained across generations because it worked, and replaced only when a better solution. Hopped beer, with its longer shelf life, its commercial scalability, became available. The body that drank ale every day for 40 years was not a body being harmed. It was a body being fed. Third, the trenchers. The thick stale bread that served as the plate, the alms basket at the gate. The poor who were waiting for it, receiving the plate that was also the meal, the system that made charity automatic and inescapable, that required no decision on the day because the decision had been built into the equipment. The trencher system says something about how this society understood food as infrastructure, not as a personal matter, not as a private consumption, but as a material that moved through the community in ways that were managed and expected and embedded in the daily structure of how a household operated. The used plate was the donation. The donation was not optional. You could not eat without generating the mechanism of the obligations. The fire has nearly gone. The glow in the hearth is embers now. The orange, red of wood that has burned through the flame stage and is doing its last sustained radiating. The warmth from it is minimal, but present, a thin extension into the room that the cold is gently reclaiming from the edges. Your body is generating its own warmth from everything it has processed today. The ale and the bread and the pottage and the fish and the pepper and the vinegar, all of it converting into the heat that keeps a body at 37 degrees through an English January night, which is a metabolic achievement that requires fuel. And the fuel was today, and today was sufficient. Fourth, the 28 musicians in the pie at Lille, the feast of the pheasant, the political theatre of Philip the Good, the pastry coffin large enough for an orchestra, the lid removed and the music beginning. What this reveals, among other things, is the distance between the top and the bottom of the food system we have spent tonight inside. The person eating bread and salt fish on a fast day in a two-room house in 15th century England, and the person watching musicians emerge from a pastry at a Burgundian ducal feast, are living in the same century, subject to the same church calendar, eating food from the same general supply chains, and experiencing the result in completely different registers. The system that produced the trencher dole also produced the musicians in the pie. Both were solutions to the same organising problem: how to use food to communicate something about the social order, at opposite ends of the resources available for that communication. The trencher said, "This household has enough to share its used plate with the poor." The pie said, "This household has enough to bake an orchestra." Fifth, and finally, the turkey leg. The turkey that was not there. The bird that arrived in Europe from the Americas in the early 16th century and became, through a series of historical accidents and the persistent optimism of themed entertainment, the universal symbol of a diet that predates it by centuries. The turkey leg being sold at the Renaissance fair is not wrong in any dramatic sense. It is simply not medieval. It is not 15th century. It is a later thing wearing an earlier costume, which is a practice that has a long history and shows no signs of ending. What it represents beyond its own anachronism is the gap between what we imagine when we imagine the past and what the past actually contained, which is generally less dramatic and more specific and more interesting than the version we invented. The bread was dense, the ale was pale, the fish was preserved and soaked for days. The pie was large enough to hold 28 musicians. The turkey was elsewhere, in a continent that England did not yet know existed. This was the food. You are nearly asleep. The room is doing what rooms do when everyone in them is nearly asleep. It settles. It contracts slightly in the cold. The sounds it makes are the sounds of materials responding to temperature rather than the sounds of people. The fire has gone to ash. The rush light has burned out. The darkness is full. The cold has moved in from the corners to the middle distance. Not yet at the bed, not yet at the body, but present in the room, in the way that January cold in England is always present in unheated rooms at this hour. Your body is warm. The ale and bread and fish and pottage and pepper sauce that constituted today are doing their work, keeping the temperature at the level required, sustaining the machinery of a body that will wake tomorrow and eat again. The bread will be 3 days old by tomorrow morning. It will be there. The ale jug will be refilled before you wake. The fire will need rebuilding. The fast day calendar will be checked, or remembered without checking, and the question of what protein today permits will have an answer. The same answer it always has. The answer that the church decided centuries ago, and that the household has been living with ever since. The stockfish is still soaking. The eel traps are still in the river. The herring barrel is still in the corner of the pantry, doing what herring barrels do, which is to wait and to smell like herring, and to be there when you need it. You were in 15th century England today. You ate what they ate, or a version of it. The bread and the ale and the fish and the fasting and the pottage and the sauce made from vinegar and salt, and one small pinch of pepper that cost more than it should. You sat at the table where your position was marked by the grade of bread placed in front of you. You contributed your trencher to the basket. You lived within the church's calendar without being asked whether you agreed with it. You heard, in the distance, music coming from inside a pie, and you understood this as an event rather than a question, because this was the world, and the world contained this event, and you were in it. Sleep, the fire is ash. The room is dark. The bread is on the shelf for morning, and the ale is in the jug, and the cold is doing what cold does in January in England, which is to continue without urgency, without particular malice, until morning arrives and the whole system starts again. It will start again. It has been starting again in this room, or in rooms like it, for longer than anyone in the room can count. You are part of that count now. You are part of it tonight. That is enough. Good night.